All righty. So as we were talking about, today's session is going to be on technically spike stories, right? But before we talk about spike stories, it's important to actually understand what story points are, right? Because that is essentially what brought up the idea of should a spike story be pointed? That is ultimately the conversation of today. But before we get into that, we need to actually understand what are story points, right? Hence, I want to bring this topic up because it seems like a lot of people have different concepts on what story estimation or what story pointing is. So I'm going to put this out there. What is your idea or concept or definition of a story point? Any ideas or concept? What is a story point? Based on your experience, your knowledge, right? And of course, the different types of team you've worked with as a Scrum Master or an aspiring Scrum Master or as an Agile coach. What is your concept or definition of story points? Who wants to take that? Story point, what is it? Any takers?
Remember, 97% of you are back here. You're familiar with this, so we should see some hands up. 97% of you are practicing Scrum Masters and have been here before, so we should see some hands up.
All right, I see Dorcas. Can you go ahead?
Yes, please. I'm so sorry. I'm driving, so it's gonna be some music after drive. But to me, I feel like story points are just requirements, and it's story points are like requirements that we use to estimate like the effort that requires for the story to be completed. So and with story points, normally we use Fibonacci sequence. I think that's the number that goes from, I think it's 0, 1, 3 to look at that story point. So in essence of what I'm saying is like story point is like an estimate of the effort that needs to be required to complete that story. Thank you.
Okay. So from your definition, it sounds like story points are criterias to use to give an estimate based on the Fibonacci sequence on what it would take to be able to deliver a requirement. Did I capture that correctly?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other ideas or concepts? Any ideas, concepts on what story point is? All right, so let's dive in a little bit, right? Good point Dorcas made, right? So it says agile estimation, right, is essentially a way to relatively size a story or a requirement based on multiple factors. And those factors are these 5 factors, right? Complexity, business values, risk, amount of work, oftentimes called value or level of effort, right? And as well as dependencies. Now, let's go about breaking these down, right? So in order to estimate a story, right? And what are user stories? User stories are written in business perspective, right? User story is essentially the functionality that we want to deliver at the end of an increment, right? Either to customers, to business, or to stakeholders, however we want to define that, right? So essentially at the end of an increment or at the end of a sprint, we should have some deliverables. We should have a shippable product that would bring value or value to the business or to customers that we have. But before we're able to deliver that value, right, at the end of the sprint, or before we even start committing to a user story within a given sprint or within a given iteration, we need to understand what is going to take or the level of effort is going to take to be able to deliver that within a given sprint, right? Because the goal of a sprint is to have something functional, to have something delivered, right? To have a deliverable at the end of the sprint. But how do we define those deliverables? We do that through estimations, right? But in order to estimate, there are criterias or there are things that we need to consider before we go about estimating a user story, right? And some of those criterias are complexity. What does it mean for a user story, for you to define or understand what it means for a story to have complexity within it? Who in here can understand or can give a little brief or highlight when we say complexity within a user story? Who can define that? And also, if you can give an example, that would also be helpful, right? So who in here wants to take that?
I will go ahead first.
Okay,
All right.
go ahead, Brian.
Prima phone, we're going to take your answer. However, next time, please raise your hand, the digital hand. And Dorcas, you can put down your digital hand. Thank you.
All right, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think complexity is when the story has a lot of dependencies.
Okay, so when a story has a lot of dependency, that amounts to the complexity of it. Okay, good point. What else? Who else? Who else? What else? Let's keep this going.
It's not clear.
Okay, it's not clear. All right. Annabelle, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah. In my opinion, yeah, I want to think that complexity is how difficult the story seems. The more difficult it is, the higher the number for estimation, right? So
Okay.
I don't think it's dependency, right?
Okay. Good point. Good point. So to you, it sounds, can you actually give an example when you say the difficulty is what define the complexity of the story?
Okay, say for instance, we have a story and the developers kind of don't think the stories, the work to put into that story is not as difficult. Okay, I'm gonna use like a baseline story. I don't know, I'm trying to make an example. Something that is not so hard. So everybody in the team don't think it's as hard as another story point. So the complexity of one story relative to another is less. I don't know, I'm thinking like it's not as high as another story point. That's I don't know how to explain it, Jerry. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just trying to get the words out.
It's okay. Yeah. It's all about inspecting and adapting and being able to, give it a shot. No, there's nothing wrong with giving it a shot. So thank you for giving it a shot.
It's a good attempt.
All right. I wanted to come up with a story in my head. Like we're working on like creating a phone login, and then my developers don't think like creating the login is as difficult as putting a feature in that particular project. So I think like creating a login is easier than putting a feature.
I'll send you a lot of stuff, Sha.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Please mute yourself.
Thank you so much, ma, for checking up on me.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Bye, ma.
You start work already?
No.
Someone was saying something, right? Was it Annabelle?
Yes, it was me. I think I was done.
Okay, no problem. All right, thank you for giving a shot. Who else wanted to go? I don't know which hand was first. I see Dorcas and I see Chanel.
I can go next. This is Chanel. Hello, everyone. The stories can be estimated on complexity based on, for instance, if they're not using templates, because sometimes when they write codes, it's like a pre-written code, and it can be more complex if the code is not pre-written. That's one way. And then another way is if you need a third-party vendor to integrate into your system to accomplish a task. So there's a lot of times where you need third-party vendors to accomplish something. So if your team is not experienced in trying to, I guess, accomplish their task, you may need a third-party vendor, and that requires research to find the vendor that can accommodate the task that you're trying to complete. I hope everyone understood what I meant by that. Because
Thank you.
sometimes it takes a lot of research to find the vendor that can do the task that sometimes has never been done in your organization or even in your team. So it takes research and it takes just different factors. So that's one thing that you need to take into consideration when you're pointing your stories is, has that been done before? Is this new to us? Is it new to the team? Thank you.
I think you also just tapped a little bit when we go into Spike Story, but thank you for that.
Sorry,
All
thank you.
right. Dorcas, I think you still have your hand up.
Yes. I'm gonna piggyback on what Annabelle said. This complexity when it relates to user story is like how large the user story is. So example is like for my team, we were looking at one user story. One team member said it was 12, other team members said it was 3. So everybody then after we went back again to the board, everybody agreed it was 12. So that's a complexity right there. It's too large of a story of a user story. So the complexity now has to be broken down so that we can actually make it less complex. I think that's the way I see complexity. It's a story that needs to be breaking down to a smaller portion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So you all made excellent point, and I also think Ashley gave a good definition of complexity, right? Also, another way to look at it, right? Say, for example, I have this bottle of water, right? Or this empty bottle of water. When we're looking at complexity, I can easily say, take this bottle to a tap and fill it up, right? That's a process, and that's a tap filling the bottle. That can be something that is not that complex to do. However, if I then tell you to take this little cup, right, and try to fill in water in this cup, in this little tappy thing, and use it to fill this empty bottle up. Now the complexity is a little bit more, right? Because now it's a little bit more effort, and we're using this little thing to fill up this, right? It's a bit different than if I just put this under the top and let the top fill it up. Then now, if I now start having to look at other smaller increments just to build this big functionality, right? So the amount of work, the level of effort is going to take in the sense of the volume that it would take to be able to accomplish that specific user story, right? All of that includes, and everything else you all just said as well, includes when it comes to considering the complexity of a story. Now let's move a little bit further down. It says business value. What does that mean to consider business value before we go about estimating a story? Who wants to take a shot on that? Business value. What does that mean when we're estimating? Where are my Scrum Masters and my Agile coaches? Dorcas, is that an old hand or a new hand?
I was gonna give it a try. I don't know. I mean, I
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was gonna give it a try. I'm sorry, did you say can I please?
Yeah, go ahead,
Hello?
please.
Okay. So I think this is business value. We say like it's like a liability. I'm not sure about business value because I haven't really like that right yet. I think that the business value, I think that it's like the liability or maybe the story or the like. I'm not too sure about that. Thank you.
Okay. I was trying to
Well, so you're getting there, Dorcas, you just didn't have the confidence because what is the liability? Where does it lie, right? And then you might get closer to the answer there. I think Yara had her hand up next.
Thank you. Hi everyone. So business value basically is what benefits does it bring to the company overall? So let's say we're working on making sure clients have access to the ATM. So the value it'll bring is that it'll generate more income, or for example, if clients are not dealing with representative and they're dealing with machines, we will have less complaints. For example, saying that I dealt with a clerk and they provided me bad service. So basically it's the value it's going to bring to the company in terms of like financial value or assets, just basically that. What value does it bring? What benefit does it bring to the company overall?
Good shot, good shot. Nice one. All right. Who else had their hand up? Thank you, Rana. I think, was it Boss had her hand up or no?
Yeah, I did have my hand up. Yeah, I was going to say that, it's the amount of value that, that particular story brings to the company, just, like the previous person has said. So is it is the value enough for us to take it in at this point in the sprint, or is it something that we can lead to the next sprint, depending on what it is that we want to achieve at that point in time. So, yeah.
Thank you. That was excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Doris?
Hey, everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, business value in this sense, we will be looking at the user story. No, if completed, is it going to bring, achieve the business goal sets? The company got business goals, and the sprint also got their sprint goal. So the user story we're working on, looking at the values, is what is going to bring at the end is what we'll talk about, the business value.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So when we're talking about business value, right, in addition to what everyone has also said, right, that also indicates the priority of that particular story in the sprint, right? Because the business value dictates the priority that story should be, right? And the level of importance of that story. So that way we are able to understand, is this something that is relevant, right? And that would actually bring value to the business if we implement it, right? So it's important to also consider that, how valuable or the importance or the priority of that story within when we're either refining or we're planning, right? So it's important to consider that before we go about estimating. And oftentimes product owners, right, they will use different techniques in understanding those priority, whether it comes to Moscow technique, right? That's typically one of the, I guess, if you want to call it most used way of or techniques in prioritizing user stories in the backlog. So it's important to understand what value would that particular user story bring to the business, right? And the priority order of that user story before we go about estimating. All right, now we move into the next one that talks about risk. What does that mean? And why is it important for us to consider risk before we go about estimating a story? Who wants to take that one?
I don't know if it's my Zoom, Victoria. I can't see the raise hand button. Going back to what you said, risks. So a risk is, to my understanding, uncertainty of a user story, what we don't know. If we do this user story, what is going to happen? why are we doing this work? These are some things that we used to point out. And also one of the characteristics of a user story I can also add is the invest criteria, which is a user story should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small. But a risk is, to my understanding, what might happen while we're doing this story. It can be a bug, it can be a dependency that we need to sort out while we're working on this user story. Maybe we have a dependency from another team. That can also be a risk. So as a Scrum Master, how do we identify those? Is making a list of those risks and see as a team member if we're going to own it. Can we still deliver this with this risks? Can we still deliver the user story with this risks? Are we going to be able to mitigate those risks? And we also have to communicate these risks to the business side, keeping them aware and being transparent. That is my understanding.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Any addition to that? What are risks? Any takers? Any additional takers? All right, so to jump in addition to what Aziz also mentioned, right? So when it comes to whether it's refinement meeting and we're talking about those user story, right? Before we point them, it's important to outline what are some of those risks. And of course, there are different types of risk, right? It can be a budget risk, it can be a resource risk, it can definitely be a technical risk or functionality risk, right? When we talk about resource risk, do we actually have enough resources to be able to develop that work, right? That's where capacity comes in place. We need to be mindful of that. Do we have the people? And not just the number of people. Do we also have the right skill set to be able to deliver that work, right? It's important to be mindful of that, right? Because you might have a Java developer, but you don't have a Drupal developer, or you don't have an Appian developer, and that particular user story needs something else that you guys don't have, right? So it's important to be mindful of that. And then when we identify what type of risk it is, so say, for example, it's a resource risk. Now we need to be mindful that we do not have the right resource to be able to do this work. What can we do then to be able to ensure that we do have the right risk, or we either reach out as a Scrum Master, this is part when you start reaching out to find other resources that can be able to align with you to be able to accomplish that user story, right? When it comes to skill sets, do we have someone else that we can pair with? Do we have other people that we can do KT session with or knowledge transfer with, right? Do we have SMEs that can actually coach the team? If it's a system risk, do we have people who own that system that we can actually share the system with them, or we can align and coordinate with them to be able to learn about those systems or be able to use those systems, right? So those are things that we need to talk about. We need to understand when it comes to risk before we can go about estimating a user story, right? So understand the layers of risk, the type of risk it is, how we can go about solutioning that risk, right? What have we identified for those risks before we can go about estimating that user story? Now we move a little further down. Amount of work, AKA volume of work. Why should we consider that before we estimate? Any takers?
I have a question about the risk value, please. Do we deduct the risk for when it comes to the time that the development team will be available? Do we deduct the risk from there, or where do we deduct the risk from? Thank you so much.
So I think your question is more in relation to the overall story points and capacity, right? That's a little bit different and not necessarily in alignment with risk, if I understand the question you're asking. And I'm assuming the question you're asking, right? The deduction of story points, right, before you commit. That essentially deals with when you start doing your capacity and velocity planning, right? And you do not have the resources, or you do not have what it takes to be able to accomplish that particular commitment or velocity that you guys have planned for that sprint. And typically, as a Scrum Master, it's important to have a conversation with the dev team, right? To understand, is that the method that you guys are following, right? Because you might be using deduct a point for a day that someone is not there, someone is not available to do the work. That might be part of your working agreements, right? So it's important to have that conversation with your team, and you guys have come into an agreement that that is what the practices that you actually want to follow before you start incorporating that, right? Whereas you might have some teams that say, hey, someone is going to be out of date. That doesn't matter. That's not really a risk to us. We can still be able to work together and get it done. Do not deduct, right? So that is also something that as a team, you need to have that conversation with your team. So that way you guys can be coherent and be in line with what processes you guys want to follow. And then you need to identify that in your working agreement. So moving forward, we know this is the process that we'll be following. Does that answer your question? Whomever that was.
That was Dorcas.
Dorcas. Does that answer your question?
Also, if I may add, Victoria, risk, and this will be a good segue into amount of work, right? Where the risk can be assessed on unknowns, right? We don't know what this this issue is, and to take it up might require more than what we can handle or not, depending on what it is. So, and the amount of work that will take, how long it will take to figure it out and come up with a solution. And then also at the end of your sprint, go put that solution as a viable product. When you look at that, that also can be termed as a risk, especially when we're assessing it for story points.
All right, thank you, Humphrey, for that. Shoma, I see your hand is raised.
I was going to answer the amount of work, why it's important. Yeah. So it's important to categorize the amount of work because our sprint is 2 weeks, and we don't accept any story that's higher than 5 or 8. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's the reason we consider the amount of work. Make sure it's not big.
So if to kind of reiterate or I guess align what you're trying to say, right? So rule of thumb when it comes to story points, right? Whenever a story is greater than 8 story points, it's important to encourage the team to break it down into a smaller portion, right? Especially if we're given a 2-week sprint. And if you do the whole 1 story points per day, that kind of give a reasoning why it's important to try to stick with 8 story points and nothing greater if you have a 2-week sprint. So of course, amount of work would play a role in that. If they're estimating something that is bigger, then we need to coach or guide them in breaking the story down into a little bit smaller portion, right? And even part of Scrum is being able to deliver something in small increments, right? And ensuring that within that 2-week or 3-week or 4-week sprint or 1-week sprint, whatever iteration or cadence we're using, we're actually able to deliver those increments at the end of the sprint. And how do we ensure that we're able to forecast our likelihood of delivering those increments at the end of the sprint is by paying attention to all of these 5 components, right? And the amount of work. Therefore, that would allow us to estimate it. And if we're estimating something that is of greater number, then we need to break it down into smaller portions so that way we can be able to fit it within a given sprint and ensure that we can deliver it, right? So amount of work is important, and kind of elaborating on what Sharma just said, clarifying a little bit of what Sharma is saying. All right, now when it comes to dependencies, what does that mean, right? And what are some examples of dependency and why should we be mindful of it? Do we have any takers?
I do wanted to say something.
Oh yeah, no, that was on the amount of work. I don't want to take you guys back since we already moved on to dependency, but I just want to add, when we saying amount of work here, we talking about effort. That's what we mean here by amount of work. Basically efforts, how much effort needed for this work, the size of this work, like Victoria was saying, do we need to break them to subtasks? That's just, I just want to understand that amount of work can simply mean the effort it will take for this user story, which is very important to look at before we story point.
All right, any further, Trauma? I see you have your hand up. And to make a little clarity, right? Typically when we have a story, we're breaking the story into other smaller portions of story, right? So that way we can estimate those other smaller stories. And oftentimes then when a team commit to the story, some team have the process or their rule of breaking those stories into task or subtask, right? So just a little clarity and mindfulness of how that process works. Trauma, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I wanted to talk about dependency. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but dependency is if we can do the story in the sprint. So if this story is dependent on another Scrum team, are we going to complete that story in this sprint, something like that?
Okay.
Right?
A part of it, right? A part of it is important to understand those dependencies, right? Outline them. There are different types of dependencies. You can have external dependencies, whereas the current work that you're working on is dependent on another Scrum team or another team in general, right? So it's important to understand those dependencies when those external team are going to be able to actually provide the information that you need, so that way you can actually prioritize the story within a given or set sprints, right? So that's one way of trying to mitigate those dependencies if you have external dependencies. What else can be part of dependencies? Any other concepts, ideas?
Well, if I can also add, dependency can be, maybe we're waiting for a testing environment. Maybe sometimes we have user stories that require testing. Now, also sometimes, as we know, capacity, we cannot have our QA because in a Scrum team, they have specific people, not everybody do testing. In some organization, they have a QA who do testing. Maybe that person is not available within a time period. Maybe other team is using that testing environment. This is something that you have to point out before you story point. What are the dependency? Does this story have testing? The timeline for it to be in testing? Can it be in testing? Do we have the capacity for testing? Do we have the environment? So that also can be a dependency to point out before you allocate a story point.
Awesome. Thank you for giving those examples as well, right? So it's important to understand the types of dependencies we have, right? It can be a functional dependency, technical dependency, environmental dependency, right? Such as if you need testing environment to be ready at a certain point, it can be external dependency. It can even be dependency within stories, right? One story has to start before another story begins, or one story has to start, finish before another story can continue, right? So it can even be those type of dependencies. And it's important to understand those dependencies because that would in turn help with the priorities of those stories. So that way you guys can go about estimating what is going to take, or the level of effort is going to take to outline those dependencies and still be able to deliver within that sprint, or even guide the team to understand that we do have dependencies that maybe we need to now break that story down a little bit further, so that way stories can be worked on independently within a sprint, right? So all of that is important before we can go about story pointing or estimating a story. All right, moving on. Hopefully we got the gist of story pointing. Now moving on to the next part, right? Whereas when you're looking at a story, right, it's important to look at all of that. But before you story point, something needs to happen first. Who can identify that? What needs to happen in order for us to even go about estimating? Who wants to take a shot? And also looking at this picture to kind of give you an idea of concept of what I'm talking about. I know Iyabo raised her hand first.
Iyobosa.
Iyobosa.
Yeah. We need to make sure that the story is ready to be worked on. So we've considered that, we've taken care of all the complexities, values, all that sort of thing. And we're sure that, we can take this particular story in the sprint and we should be able to complete it.
Okay. So prior to all of that, what does the developer typically do? Choma, I see your hand is raised as well.
Also to what she said, I don't know, prior to story point, we do our capacity planning to see who's doing the work before you estimate.
Okay, typically capacity planning, right, is done way after. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with story pointing, right? You story point, and then when you do your sprint planning and you're ready to commit, then that's when you begin to focus on capacity planning and all of that. But typically, right, even looking at the picture, when I have a story in front of me, we need to do some questioning, right? We need to understand the resources or the tools that we have to be able to do the work, to even start getting a clarity on the complexity, the business value, the risk, the amount of work and the dependency it would take to then estimate, right? And oftentimes developer will ask questions, right? So looking at the picture, if the story is saying that, give me an estimate of what it would take to go from point A to point B with the first diagram versus the second diagram, right? Typically, developers will have questions. This is why, as a Scrum Master, it's also important to empower your team or encourage your team to open up and ask questions, because through questions, we can understand those complexity, what business value it is, right? We can understand the risk, the amount of work and dependencies involved, right? And oftentimes they'll ask you, do we have the right tools? What platform are we using? Are the database team going to be there? Do we need certain files? Do we need certain database, right? The type of UI or design we're trying to develop, right? They would ask questions, such as if we're looking at this picture and I'm looking at the first picture and I said, tell me the story points, or estimate the story point is going to take from you to get from point A to point B. You're probably going to be asking me, did it rain that day? Is it going to rain? Is that why the floor or the road seems slumpy, right? Did it rain? How much rain did it was it, right? What type of car are we going to be using, right? Is it a four-wheeler or is it a two-wheeler, right? All of that will make a difference, right? Because if I'm using a four-wheeler, it's going to probably be of a less complexity or less amount of work that it will take me to drive, right? Because the car has more support, has more engine power, right? Has better tire, I think, to be able to drive on that road. Hence, the complexity will be a little bit less, right? So all of that is important for them to be able to really tell you the complexity of, or the level of effort is going to take to estimate. So it's important for them to ask questions. Ask questions first. It doesn't matter who's working on that story. Ask questions, then complexity, business value, risk, amounts of work, dependency comes next, and then we're able to estimate. Even with asking questions, right, we need to consider the experiences, the skill sets, right? All of that plays a role to help us understand those 5 guidelines that we've outlined, right? Before we can then estimate. Does that make sense, or does anyone have any question? Silence is golden. We're gonna move on. All right. I think some of you also pointed out the whole Fibonacci sequence, right? Fibonacci sequence. And it starts with 1, and then we go into 2, and then we go into 3. And it actually has a syncronym that it goes by. Who can identify what the syncronym or whatever they call it, what that is? Who can identify the mathematics towards this? We're all Scrum Master. We use this all the time. So please, let's go.
Add the numbers. The 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 give you 2. The previous number give you the, I'm not good at math, so forgive me. I don't know how to say this well. But basically, you add the 1 plus 2, it give you 3. 3 plus 2 give you 5. 5 plus 3 give you 8. 8 plus 5 give you 13. That's how Fibonacci sequence is. So that's the mathematics.
True. So, right, you add the number to the previous number. Essentially, that whole relative measurements, right? To be able to give you the next, please mute yourself, which will be able to identify the hierarchy or the complexity of that particular user story, right? As is mentioned, the whole math aspect of that. So it's important to actually know what that math aspect and the incremental value of that, and also know what number comes next, right? So that way, when your teams are estimating, you're able to guide them in reference to the points that they're given. And as I mentioned before, right, the rule of thumb when the story is 8 or 13 story points, is advisable to help the team or encourage the team to break it down, right? But teams are different. There are teams that are capable of picking up 13 story points within the sprints, right? If they're able to do that, then that's fine, right? As long as we understand that the story can be worked independently and does not have any dependencies or any other risk that is involved, and they are confident that they can be able to actually deliver that at the end of the sprint, then of course we can allow that, right? As long as that's something that is negotiated within the team. However, it's definitely advised to help them break it down. All right, moving on. This is just a diagram of all of the Fibonacci sequence number and what it means, right? I'm not gonna go through all of them, but it's important to understand kind of like the incremental value, right? When it's a 1 or 2, that means something is relatively small, right? Please mute yourself. When it's 1 or 2, it means it's relatively small. When it's 3 or 5, that means it starts getting a little bit bigger, right? 5, 8 means it's a medium size. 8, 13 means it's a large user story. And then of course, when it starts going to 20, 20, then that's kind of going towards an epic, right? So it's important to always guide your team once the story starts getting bigger. We need to guide them to break it down into smaller story, right? So that way we're ensuring that we're actually able to deliver incrementally and have something that is functional at the end of the sprint, right? That's the goal. All right. Now let's talk about what we actually all came here for, right? I'm going to give me 1 minute.